Tessa, hello and welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you.
So, we'll start as we do with every episode by asking you the question, what's the wrong you want to right?
So, the wrong that I would like to right is the horrific problem of food waste. So, you might or might not know, but globally, a third of all the food we produce each year gets thrown away, which is worth over $1 trillion US. And then alongside that, we have 800 million people who go to bed hungry every night, who could be fed on a quarter of the food that we waste in the Western world. And as if that weren't bad enough, the environmental impact of food waste is nothing short of devastating. So, if it were to be a country, food waste would be the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after the USA and China. And then when you kind of dig into the problem of food waste specifically, it's really quite shocking to discover that in a country such as the UK, half of all food waste takes place in the home. So that means that big problem that I've just shared with you, each and every one of us, we are responsible for half of that. But if you flip it on its head, that actually can be quite exciting because it means that surely we can be half the solution as well.
And when we hear these numbers, it's always so shocking. And I guess one of the things which is shocking for me, as you say, is almost in a country like the UK where we have the most supply, we have the most available to us. We're like the most wasteful as well. It's like that for me is almost the one of the most depressing parts of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not a surprise though, really, because for many people, and we should be really, really clear that there's a big chunk of people in the UK, 8 million to be precise, who kind of struggle to access food. But for those who don't, I think that's part of the challenge. We have such an overabundance of food that we don't value it anymore. And so people don't think twice about chucking something into the bin. But that is, for all the reasons I've described, absolutely sort of a very wrong thing to be doing, and just kind of morally, socially, and just on a very practical level, food is quite literally our life source. And so it's really crazy that we waste it at the scale that we do. And this is going to become even more of a pressing problem because we've got another 2.2 billion people joining the planet by 2050. And in order to feed us all, according to the FAO, we need to increase global food production by over 50%. And today we have absolutely no idea how on earth we're going to achieve that. And so to me, it just seems really crazy that we're sat here kind of scratching our heads, puzzling over how we can feed a population of 10 billion people and how we can halt sort of runaway planetary heating whilst continuing to throw away a third of all the food that we produce.
Yeah, completely. And as you say, I think is the really important thing here is for people to start seeing food waste as part of the problem, but also part of the solution to the sort of bigger environmental climate challenges that we face. Um, I guess when it comes to the work that you're doing, then can you give people I guess a brief sort of introduction to Olio and how you hope how you're looking to solve this challenge?
So Olio's an app that exists to tackle the problem of food waste, specifically in the home and at a local community level. And how we do that is by connecting people with their neighbours so that you can give away rather than throw away your spare food. Because what we've discovered is that people don't enjoy throwing away food, but the challenge is that nowadays we're so disconnected from our local communities that we don't actually have anyone to give our food to. And so that's what Olio aims to do, is provide a really fun, safe and easy way for you to connect with your neighbours so that you can give away your spare. And so how it works is you just snap a photo of your spare food, you add it to the app. Neighbours living nearby get an alert. They can then browse the listings, request what they want and pop round and pick it up. And one of the most sort of common questions we get or concerns from people is, well, will anyone really want my spare food, my sort of head of broccoli or my 3 out of date tins of soup or whatever it might be? And the answer is a massive resounding yes. So half of all the food added to the app is requested in less than 21 minutes. So our biggest challenge actually is encouraging everybody to take this sort of 10 seconds or so to share their spare rather than toss it in the bin.
And what's behind that? I do find the sort of behavioural aspects of this really interesting. What do you think is behind that that misconception that people have that, oh, no one's going to want this
Yeah.
spare food that I've got? What's driving that?
I think it's because we very instinctively tend to assume that everybody else is like us. And so if I don't want this, then it's very easy to assume that no one else will want this. Right. So
That
I
makes
think
sense.
that's kind of the major driver. Um, and then I guess people, food is quite personal. So you are, just by very virtue of having something spare, there's a story and a reason behind that. And so, definitely kind of reveals something about yourself in some way. But I think it's really that former thing, the fact that we find it hard to imagine how different people might approach a situation.
And how do you see with the people who with the people who start using the app? How do you kind of see their behavior change and develop as they start, I guess, interacting with the app and actually start, I guess, giving away stuff and picking up stuff from the community? What do you kind of see as the shifts which then start to happen?
So we see quite a few shifts take place actually. So when people first join Olio, they're generally really, really excited because there's nothing else like Olio out there. And often people will start off picking something up because that just feels like the easiest first step. You just open the app, you see something, you want it, and you can request it and then pop around and pick it up. We find that once people have had that first experience, they get to meet a neighbor, they realize that that was actually quite fun. It was pretty straightforward. It was normal. And after they've had that experience, they will then tend to go back to their own homes and evaluate what they have spare that they no longer want or need that they can then go on to share. So a lot of people start off picking stuff up and then they go on to give away stuff themselves. I think in terms of the other behavior shifts we see, pretty much it's across the board. People tell us that once they've started using Olio, it really opens their eyes to the problem of not just food waste, but waste more broadly. And as a result of that, they start to proactively lead a less wasteful life. And they just start reducing waste across all elements of their day to day living. And I should say that Olio also has a non food section. So you can use that to give away books, clothes, toys, kitchen appliances, everyday household items. And that's proven to be really, really popular as well, because this is for stuff that you don't want to sell. You don't want to ship it across the country. You just want to tap a button and automatically a happy neighbor shows up and takes it off your hand. So there's definitely that kind of transition into leading a more mindful and less wasteful life. And then I think the third thing that we see happen to people is our users tell us that when they join Olio, they joined Olio because they don't like waste. But once they've used Olio, what they infuse about most is the community. It's not actually sort of, Olio looks like it's an app, but it's not. It's really a community. And people tell us that that is what feels really special and really different because they're getting to meet their neighbors in a way that they never would have. And as a result, they're starting to feel more connected to their local community. They're starting to recognize that small actions can make a pretty big difference. And people tell us they just feels very empowering and fulfilling.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting because there's some interesting contrast here. I'm being followed around the internet at the moment by adverts for a new sort of local delivery service where
Oh,
I can.
don't get me going on these.
I won't name them. You can probably
Well,
guess who it
so
might be.
solving a problem that really, I get very frustrated with these sort of, you can get your groceries now in less than 10 minutes. And I'm like, wow, talk about sort of solving a problem that didn't really need solving whilst we have literally the planet is on fire. um, and we have so many other enormous problems that need solving. But anyway, sorry, smaller side there. Tell me, you're being stalked
No,
around.
but yeah, I've been followed around by this. Yeah, it's like, oh, you can get your groceries delivered in 10, 15 minutes. And it's like, but I also, which seems crazy to me because I've got probably 20 shops within 5 minutes walk of me where I can go and pick
Yeah.
something up. But it almost seems like it's so easy to grab somebody's attention and to, I guess, to make something just a little bit easier for them. But you're trying to wake people up to a much bigger problem.
Well, we are, and I think sort of if you think about that sort of 10 or 15 minute groceries, that is stopping you from taking some exercise slash movement slash getting out in the open air. It is stopping you from sort of meeting people and connecting and building relationships locally. But it is extremely convenient, right? So whereas I think Olio is slightly less convenient, but we're definitely kind of off the charts in terms of solving a real problem that we desperately need to see solved yesterday, and building meaningful relationships and stronger local communities. So I like to think that kind of net, the world is a significantly better place as a result of each and every person who joins Olio.
Yeah, and I think the community side of it is really interesting. I think, like, it seems like it's twofold for you, really. It's the community that you're building to sort of spread the word about Olio as a service, but then it's also the offline community. It's people meeting each other, meeting their neighbors who they've lived next door to for ages and they've never had a reason to connect with before.
Yeah, so you're right. A really important part of Olio are our volunteers. So we have two types of volunteers. We have our ambassadors. So they're people who are really passionate about the Olio mission. They want it to work in their local community. And so we give them all the tools that they require to get Olio kickstarted in their local community. And that is a combination of both digital content that they can share, but also kind of old school, hyper local guerrilla marketing tactics. So posters and letters and flyers. And our ambassadors definitely have a strong sense of community, both amongst themselves, but also feeling that they're really helping make a difference to their own local community through bringing Olio there. And then the second type of volunteer we have are our food waste heroes. So we've now got 25,000 trained volunteers who we match with their local store, which could be a supermarket or a bakery or deli or corporate canteen. And those volunteers provide a service to that store whereby at the end of the day, they'll pop out their house across the road. They'll collect all of the unsold food from that business. They'll then take it home, add it to the app. Within minutes, the Olio neighbors are requesting it, and minutes later, they're popping around and picking it up.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. What? So, very immediately tackling the problem of stuff which is already in the shops, but will just immediately go in the bin and not even be bought by anyone.
Yeah. So it's important, I guess, to kind of put that into context and to look at why we're doing it. So Olio exists really to tackle the problem of food waste in the home, which is where half of all food waste takes place. And actually, just retail stores account for just 2% of all food waste. But what we found is that through matching our volunteers with those local stores and bringing that supermarket, for example, surplus food onto the app, then really gets Olio kickstarted in a local community because it triggers all the notifications, which brings people into the app. They pick something up, they have their experience, they meet a neighbor, and it's really the flywheel, or I guess the fire starter of then that local flywheel.
I see. Well, yeah. One of the questions I had down to ask you was about what have you seen as the best tools or the best channels or the best communications to drive growth of the app over the past. I guess is it sort of 6 years now since you
Yeah,
launched?
yeah.
What have been those things? Maybe that is what you've said there is part of the question of where you've found to be able to drive that growth. But are there any other I guess things you've learned from that perspective?
So our ambassadors, I've already mentioned, play a really, really critical role in getting Olio launched all over the country and all over the world. So we've had items successfully shared in 59 countries so far. And that is really down to the fact that we're empowering passionate people to get Olio kickstarted near them. So our ambassadors have been a really important lever of growth. The Food Waste Heroes program has been really important. And a big breakthrough for us was last year. We were sort of made an agreement with Tesco to scale across their whole store portfolio. So we are now collecting and redistributing across their 2,700 stores to enable them to not be throwing away so much food. So that's been a real engine of growth. And PR has always been really important for us. And then in terms of paid marketing, it's really been performance marketing to date. And more lately, we've also been experimenting with TV as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, so a big mix. That's interesting. You mentioned about Tesco there as well. I guess are we seeing now some of the biggest companies and corporations sort of finally sort of waking up to their sort of responsibility to in when it comes to these problems?
We are, thank goodness. So I have to sort of take my hat off to Tesco. They have been real pioneers and leaders in this space. It did take us 3 years of conversations to kind of get it over the line, but they are really, really leading the industry in terms of making very public commitments to eliminate food waste from their business. And they also measure and report publicly on their food waste. And they have really kind of pushed forward in terms of working with innovative solutions such as Olio. And we're seeing that approach actually now sort of cascade through the industry. And I think the best way to describe the change that's happening is via analogy. So, in the fashion industry, for example, child labor was pretty endemic, but it has now been sort of measured and monitored as far as possible, kind of largely out of supply chains. It's no longer acceptable to have that happening in your business, and the same is now starting to happen, thankfully, around food waste. It is no longer acceptable to be seen to be throwing perfectly good food in the bin when there are so many people living nearby who would like it or maybe even need it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess, yeah, increasingly you're seeing people will start to make more decisions based on what they see as a company's impact on society, not just the products that they make or what they're selling. I think interesting there as well. You kind of mentioned about it, sort of alluded to the sort of transparency that is required. I guess what have you been able to measure so far about the impact that Olio's had and all the food that has not been wasted and has been reshared?
I think you're absolutely right that measurement is really, really important. So that kind of, I guess, gives people comfort, but also inspiration that the actions that are being taken are having an effect. So for Olio, we know that to date, we have shared over 18 million portions of food. And the environmental impact of that is equivalent to taking 52 million car miles off the road, which apparently is equivalent to driving all the way to Mars and halfway back.
Wow.
So, an awful lot of car miles have been taken off the road in terms of environmental impact. And then, in terms of our water impact, we have saved 2.6 billion litres of water as a result of saving this food. And that's because food production is incredibly water intensive. So, actually, 3/4 of all of humanity's fresh water supply is used in the food production industry.
Wow. No, that's really interesting. Um, I had a couple of other things jotted down, and I think obviously everything at the moment comes back to a bit of a reflection on the last sort of 12 months. And I guess there's been a couple of things like I was thinking on the way in about the empty supermarket shelves, which we had in I guess like middle of March when lockdown was seemingly sort of pending or coronavirus was on the way. Did that have an impact in our sort of understanding and thinking about food, do you think?
It absolutely did. There's that saying that a picture says 1,000 words. And in my mind, this is a classic example of that because we sort of collectively realized that food is valuable. And we felt that in a really kind of visceral sense because we felt some nerves and some anxiety about our ability to access food, which for many people in this country, that was the first time. And so almost overnight, we saw just a step change in terms of how people were valuing food. And so there's some research by an organization called Hubbub that showed that over 50% of people said they were valuing food much more. And as a result, they were also wasting food a lot less.
Yeah, it's just always really stuck with me. And then I guess like what then happened with the sort of free school meals and various government decisions, and then U-turns and all the campaigning, which Marcus Rashford and various other people were behind. I guess that shone a light, and as you alluded to at the start, in this country we have this massive surplus, but it's not necessarily getting to the right people.
Well, we have two problems that sort of coexist alongside each other. So we have the food waste problem, which we've talked about quite a lot. And then in parallel to that, we have a hunger problem. And this was something that I must admit, when Sasha and I first founded Olio, we were not aware of that. And we have since been really, really horrified and deeply saddened to learn just how much hunger there is in the UK, a supposedly quote unquote developed country. So as I said earlier, we've got well, this is sort of pre-COVID figures. In the UK, we have 8.4 million people living in food poverty, and all the data shows that sort of post-COVID, those numbers have grown quite substantially. So that is a really, really significant portion of our population who are struggling to access food. But I think it's really, really important that the two issues aren't conflated and that we aren't very simplistic about this and think, well, why don't we take all this waste food and give it to all these hungry people and we can solve these two problems and we can all live happily ever after. That is a dangerously simplistic approach for a couple of reasons. So first of all, if you look at the food waste problem, there's kind of 10x more spare food than there are hungry people. And so actually, if we're going to solve the food waste problem, we need many more kind of structural changes, and we need everybody to be involved. And we cannot risk it being kind of stigmatized and the responsibility given to sort of hungry people to solve that problem. So we're not going to solve the problem of food waste with hungry people. And then on the other side, if you look at the problem of food poverty, the answer to that is not random handouts of surplus food. That is about solving that is about a proper living wage. It's about a much more equitable and fair and accessible society for all. And there are many other, again, kind of systemic changes that need to happen to solve the problem of hunger and food poverty rather than just random food handouts.
No, that's really interesting. That's really insightful, as you say. It's a complex web of different factors. Um, I guess have you had maybe that, as you say, is one of the sort of biggest learnings that you've had as Olio's grown and developed. What have been your other sort of biggest learnings over the course of growing the business and tackling this problem?
I think most of the learnings that I've had really kind of, other than the ones that we've covered on about sort of the size of the problem of food waste and hunger and stuff like that, have really been about how to sort of start and then scale an early stage business. And for me, I think probably the most powerful learning has been the importance of, as quickly as possible, getting product out into market, into the hands of users, and then test, measure, learn, and just doing that feedback loop as quickly as possible. I think the other sort of major, somewhat depressing learning has been that there's no such thing as a silver bullet. I think in the early days of a startup, you constantly live in hope that the next feature or the next marketing campaign is going to be the silver bullet that sends you into stratospheric growth. And in our
Mm.
experience, we've learned that unfortunately there is no such thing as a silver bullet. There's just a shit ton of lead bullets, and you just got to keep on kind of layering stuff on top, and then cumulatively that starts to bend the curve.
No, I think that's an interesting way to think about it. I think people glamorize the startup world a lot. That's yeah, suddenly you'll just hit this crazy
Yeah,
trajectory, but more
yeah.
often than not, that's not the case. Um, and just to touch a little bit, I guess, on what you're saying there about how about testing and learning. How your global footprint now? I think you said before you're in 54 countries, maybe more than that now.
Yeah, 59. Yeah.
And are you seeing different attitudes and different sort of I guess adoption behaviors around the world? Does that change radically? Do people still fundamentally have the same sort of blocker in their mind about like, oh, someone probably isn't going to want the thing I've got to give away?
So, what we've discovered is that there are way more similarities between people and markets than differences. At the end of the day, we're all humans. And so, exactly as you say, we tend to have the same concerns or the same things that excite us. The differences that we really see in the markets are much more around route to market, i.e., how do we most effectively access our audience and our community. And then we do also see some variance in terms of the mix of food versus non-food sharing. So Olio is being used an enormous amount in countries such as Mexico and Chile and Argentina. But there we're being used primarily for non-food sharing rather than food sharing. Whereas here in the UK, it's primarily food sharing.
Okay, interesting. And the non-food sharing that's happening in those countries, then what's the, yeah, I guess what's the driver there that's created that difference?
Well, I think every market does have different values in terms of food and how much they value food, how much they waste food, and also how they consume food,
Mm,
whether you're sort of consuming food in quite an isolated manner versus in a more community oriented manner. The isolated manner results in much more household food waste versus if you tend to live in larger families and larger communities. So that definitely impacts the food bit. And then there's obviously the competitive landscape as well, in terms of what other options are available for people. And so Olio's non-food offering just seems to have sort of struck a chord in those Latin American countries.
yeah, that's really interesting. Um, what's on the horizon, Tessa? What are you working on? What are you working on right now, and what will you be really focusing on in the years to come as Olio keeps growing and developing?
So right now we're working on the launch of a brand new feature which we're super excited by, which is called Borrow. So essentially connecting neighbours to be able to lend and borrow everyday household items. So think
Okay.
cat carrier, drill, fancy dress costumes, books, pasta making machines, camping stoves, etc. So that will be launching in the next couple of months.
Interesting.
You look like you're going to ask a question there.
No,
I'll pause and take
no,
that.
I just immediately thought how useful that would be. I've recently like moved flat, and that's a time when you're just like, oh, I really need a drill, or I wish
Yeah.
we've
And
not
you
got a
only need
Hoover.
it for an hour,
Yeah,
right?
and
Yeah.
you're so tempted. I'm just like, oh, should I just go and buy it? Can I go on Amazon and buy one, and it'll turn up tomorrow? That I'm then probably not
Yeah.
going to use very much ever
Yeah.
again. So that's so
It's going to
that's so
sit there.
interesting.
The world's precious. Yeah. Sort of. There's two types of waste. There's stuff that we waste because we throw it in the bin, and then there's stuff that we waste because we're not using it. And a typical American home has 300,000 things in it. And I'm pretty sure a typical British home is not that far behind. And essentially, that is the world's precious resources trapped in your home, unable to be used by anyone else. Meanwhile, someone two doors down is buying that exact same item,
Mm,
perhaps from Amazon. And we cannot continue to consume in this way. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of Earth Overshoot Day or not, but that's the day in the year in which humanity has used all the resources that the Earth can replenish in a year. And when it was first measured back in 1969, Earth Overshoot Day was the 31st of December. And so what that means is humanity used in a year what the Earth could replenish in a
mhm,
year. If you fast forward to last year, Earth Overshoot Day was the 22nd of August.
mm.
And so what that means is every single thing that every single one of us 7.5 billion people consumed after the 22nd of August last year was net depleted to the planet. And so at the moment, we're collectively living and consuming resources as if we have 1.75 planets, which obviously we do not. And so that's why I feel really, really passionately that we're going to have to completely rewrite our models of consumption, and sharing of resources is going to have to be a real linchpin of that new model. And that's why we're really excited to be launching Borrow.
That's really interesting, and this seems to tie into, I guess, something I'm trying to learn a lot more about at the moment, like Web 3.0 and sort of more decentralized ways of people organizing and organizing and communicating and doing things where people aren't just going to default to go and buy something from one massive retailer, but they're going to use the technologies which are developing like yours to actually just solve that problem in a better way. That's really interesting. Um, Tessa, I've learned an awful lot here. I've got three final questions to ask you. The first one: what
Mm-hmm.
did you used to believe that you no longer believe in?
I think when I was growing up and early on in my career, I was perhaps a little bit naive and idealistic. I used to think that the world was a lot fairer than it is. And in particular, if I take the issue of gender, certainly growing up and then in my early career, I didn't personally directly experience any inhibitions on my aspirations or my career. But then as I got more senior, And as I'm trying to challenge the status quo, I have realized that there is absolutely an enormous smashing kind of glass ceiling there. And in particular, in the area of fundraising in the startup world. So female founders get just 1% of all venture capital investment. Male founded businesses get 89% of the investment, and mixed teams get the delta.
Right.
And that is insanely frustrating and infuriating and depressing. And that has been a really, really harsh wake up call for me. And it's come at precisely the time when I'm more motivated and have a greater sense of urgency than I ever have around the importance of my work and what I'm doing. And I also look around at other entrepreneurs and I see that it is female founders, it is founders who are from diverse backgrounds more broadly in terms of ethnicity or socioeconomic background. They're the ones who are out there solving the real problems facing humanity today, and yet they are struggling to access capital. And that's just deeply, deeply concerning for the future and the prospects of our species, quite frankly.
Yeah, I was speaking to a woman called June Angelidi. She's a VC now, and she was
Yeah.
speaking about this exact problem where she said that female founders and founders of color, there's this trend to over mentor them. So talk to them a lot, give them lots of
Yes.
advice,
Yeah.
but
Just give
underfund.
us the bloody money. Yeah. We don't need more mentoring. We need cash.
Yeah. And do you see things? I guess what you're saying is things aren't changing at any kind of speed when it comes to that. What do you see as the things which need to the barriers which need to break down, or the catalysts for change when it comes to that?
The biggest barrier that I see is the lack of diversity amongst the gatekeepers of capital. And if I could sort of wave a magic wand, it would be to immediately make the sort of check writing level
Mm,
of investment organizations to be representative. And overnight, we would see a radical transformation in terms of the types of businesses that are getting funded. Because right now, the businesses that are getting funded are the businesses that excite a very narrow group of people. It's their areas of passion that are getting funded and are getting built,
mm.
and everything else is being neglected. And I believe that that is coming at an enormous cost to humanity because the biggest problems are not getting solved.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess more and more, and quite rightly, people are looking at the board rooms or the board tables of big businesses and saying they need to be more representative. But then this is kind of happening under the surface of there's loads of great ideas and great businesses out there which aren't being able to make valuable change because they're like suffering the same problem. Um, Secondly, Tessa, if this wasn't your mission of trying to tackle this problem of food waste, I guess in a parallel universe, what would you be focusing on?
The honest answer is I don't know, but I think there's a couple of areas I'm really interested in. So anything to do with waste more broadly, for me, is a just really, really ripe area for disruption. We cannot continue to waste our resources at the scale at which we're doing currently. So I'm fascinated with anything to do with waste reduction. And then I'm also really, really interested in how on earth we can sustainably and healthily feed a world of 10 billion people. And so I think the whole area of regenerative agriculture is a really, really interesting one. I don't know an enormous amount about it, but everything I hear about it, I find absolutely fascinating. And I feel convinced that therein sort of lies the key to being able to feed us all and fix our health and save the planet.
Completely. And finally, if you could recommend one book for members of the Journey Further book club to read, what would it be?
There's two books that I always recommend for anyone who is in the early stages of wanting to start something. The first is The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. That for us has just been a complete Bible in terms of governing how we approach everything at Olio. And then the second one is a book called The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick. And that is really, really powerful in terms of helping you figure out how to do that really early stage user research. And then if I
Okay.
can be cheeky and give a
Yeah,
third
please do.
book for anyone who wants to learn more about the climate crisis and the dire urgency of the situation, then I really recommend a book by Naomi Klein called, I think it's called Capitalism versus the Climate, or The Climate versus Capitalism. But that is a terrifying and riveting and energizing read.
Hey, thank you for those recommendations. And thank you, Tessa, for joining me on the podcast. I've learned a lot there. It's a really inspiring story and a really powerful thing you're building with Olio, tackling a really important and pressing problem.
Well, thank you for having me on. Lovely to chat to you today.